Great, thank you. Morning. Kevin Wolf. Nice to meet you.
How are you?
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, I'm president of ITIF, and I want to welcome you to, I think, what will be a great event this morning on the issue of export controls related to technology and the impact of that on U.S. technology competitiveness and national security. We have a great panel this morning. We're going to do this really more as a structured conversation, and we should have plenty of time for questions from you all, and we'll adjourn precisely at 11:30. I want to introduce, going to my left, David Hankey is the partner at Arent Fox. He's a leading national security and government relations lawyer. He advises companies on the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, which he, for some reason, knows something about because he more or less drafted that bill. He was on Capitol Hill and was the primary staff architect of FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, and the chief strategist behind its enactment. Next to David is John Neufer. John is president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA. He joined SIA in 2015. Prior to that, he was vice president for global policy here at ITI, Information Technology Industry Council, and he's also on the executive committee of the U.S. Information Technology Office, UCITO, in Beijing. And finally, Kevin Wolf. Kevin is a partner at Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. He has over 25 years' experience providing counseling and advice to businesses on laws and regulations related to export controls. Prior to joining Aiken Gump, he was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration, Bureau of Industry and Security. So those of you who don't know, BIS is the government agency in charge of determining what, if any, technology should be on export control list. He's also testified in the Senate, including on confronting threats to China, and that testimony is available on the ITIF event page. Okay, so let's start with some background. The big, I think, difference now is that we have a new law, two new laws, really. Well, one new law and one reformed law. And David was central to that in the Senate. David, can you talk a little bit about the legislation is really trying to do two things, and then it got kind of put together and then pulled apart. One was reforming CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which is all about inbound investment. And then second was the FIRMA bill, which is about exports of technology. What was Congress trying to do? What did they end up with? What were some of the compromises that were made?
Yeah, happy to talk a little bit about that and about the relationship between the two different pieces of legislation. I think it's fair to say that FIRMA came first and that ECRA sort of rode its coattails. And that's a sort of a little Senate-House snobbery if you unpack that, but I worked a long time in the Senate. So with FIRMA and ECRA both, Congress mainly wanted to prevent the continued erosion by China of our technological edge. There were a lot of other objectives as well, giving investors certainty and predictability, looking after risks involving critical infrastructure, sensitive personal data, but principally it was about technology and it was about China. Congress was very troubled by the investment-driven technology transfers to China, and they were frustrated with the inability of both CFIUS and the export control system to address these problems. It was a two-pronged issue. The conclusion was that China had taken advantage of two very clear weaknesses in the export control system, at least at that point. One was regulating the overseas transfer of critical know-how, and two was keeping pace with the rapid evolution of technology. So if you kind of rewind that, you can think foundational technologies and emerging technologies. That's where those two sort of weaknesses led to in the legislation. And with these two laws, Congress tried to address the shortcomings of the export control system and then to close up those gaps that existed in the CFIUS jurisdiction. And with the CFIUS jurisdiction specifically, the sponsors were very upset about two trends that had to do with investments. One was outbound investments. This one stirred up quite a hornet's nest with industry, but it was forced technology transfers in joint ventures that were based in China, involving what a lot of people referred to as crown jewel technologies. This was essentially a de facto acquisition of an entire business unit, replicating an industrial capability that a U.S. company had previously. And then the second sort of trend was Chinese venture capital investments in early stage U.S. technology companies in places like Silicon Valley. So you asked why Congress did what it did. I think overall, from kind of a policy standpoint, why they did what they did on CFIUS and on emerging and foundational technologies, Section 1758, part of ECRA, which is really the centerpiece. It was really because there was a growing, and I think even a stronger now, bipartisan consensus that China represents the foremost national security challenge of our lifetimes. And the concept of EFTs, or emerging and foundational technologies, was really a byproduct of this debate. First it was CFIUS, and then it was emerging and foundational technologies. And there were two key disagreements that I think it's important to flag. And they sort of go back to what I initially talked about as the two trends. But the first disagreement was over how and who should be able to screen these joint ventures for national security risks. Should it be the export control system? Should it be CFIUS? Should it be some other regulatory mechanism? And the original bill gave that to CFIUS, gave that task to CFIUS, and that definitely was controversial. It was opposed by industry. Commerce Department didn't like it, so that morphed into the foundational technology export controls, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. And then the second disagreement was in the context of the venture capital deals, was who should decide what an emerging technology is, what's essential to national security. Should that be something CFIUS can do? Should that be something that the Commerce Department does under its Export Control Authority? Who should do that? And the implementation of that is ongoing. I think we'll have to chat a little more about that. But it produced 1758. It was a very clear-cut mandate for BIS. And essentially it was Congress telling them, get serious about these technologies, the emerging technologies, the foundational technologies. Get your head in 2019, I guess 2018 at that point. And so I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So a couple of quick questions, David. One is we wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago we'll come to it. Don't worry, we'll get to the Huawei case. And this was when the administration was thinking of bringing down the 25% content down to maybe 0 or 10. And the title of the blog was Shooting Ourselves in the Foot. And we argued that that the intent of Congress was really about a blacklist. There was a lot of language in the legislative record about that. Really, this is focused on China. I was in Europe, in Brussels, a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised to hear from a Commission official that they thought that they might end up being the target of export controls someday, which was quite disturbing. And I wonder, just coming back to this one question, would it have been easier if we had put down, pretty clear we're talking about China here, maybe Russia, but we're not talking about Japan, we're not talking about Europe. It also plays out in terms of CFIUS too, where you have companies that are European or Japanese that want to buy an American company, and are we treating them the same as China? What's your thoughts on that? Obviously they didn't, so...
Yeah. Is your question specific to the CFIUS or to the way they do export
well,
controls?
both, really, both.
Well, there was a very heady debate during the development of the CFIUS legislation on whether Congress should use a blacklist or a whitelist in terms of whether there should be just a tight focus on sort of the countries that are the most problematic, or whether we should have everybody be subject to these new reviews and then have a list of friendlier, partner allied countries that would be let off the hook. And initially, the bill focused on the blacklist or the negative list approach. I think even the Chamber of Commerce and many in industry wanted to do that. It would seem like the sensible way to go. But there was strenuous objection, resistance from the administration, especially Treasury. They didn't want to do that. I think the State Department had reservations as well. And so ultimately, they were persuaded to go with a whitelist approach, which I think has certain advantages because it incentivizes countries to stand up their own foreign investment screening systems. But it certainly sweeps up a lot more deals and creates a lot more activity, a lot more work for them to do. So I'm not sure it was the ideal solution, but I think it's workable, and it has certain advantages that hopefully bear out. On export controls, obviously with all the country groups, that's baked into the way the system works, the whitelist, the blacklist, different treatments, blocks of countries. So I think that that will be a feature of the way they do emerging and foundational technologies. There's actually a requirement in Section 1758 that any country that is subject to an embargo, to include an arms embargo, there have to be export licenses for these technologies to go to them. So that is also baked in for the export control piece.
So before I turn to Kevin, I want to ask you this question about, I was interviewed by a reporter recently about the emerging and foundationals technology list, and she just assumed it was kind of every technology was going to be put on this, and that this would limit exports to even places like Canada. I mean, it was just sort of how much confusion there is about this. And I know this is a controversial issue, but are we kind of risking either going too much with EFTs or too little? Because at one level, what we're focused, what the target really is forced JVs with China. I mean, that ultimately is the biggest risk. It's not so much when Intel sends a chip to China or when Dell sends a computer to China. Those aren't, for the most part, problematic. It's really when companies are forced to give the know-how to China. Does EFT get us there, and if it does get us there, does it get us there in a way too broad way that limits other beneficial things we could be doing?
I think EFTs can get us there. I think on paper it's a very workable, balanced set of authorities. It's a mandate on commerce. Some of these authorities, I mean, Kevin can tell you chapter and verse, these were already around. They didn't really get the ability to do new things. They just had a very focused, shaped mandate from Congress. On foundational technologies, which is really what the forced JVs were about, at least during the debate, I think it is about critical know-how that goes along with it. It's not about the commodities. It's not about software. It's about the secret sauce that you need to make these things overseas, to develop this capability on your own. We haven't really heard a peep out of commerce on foundational technologies, and here we are more than a year and a half. I think about a year and a half after enactment of ECRA. That's been a little disappointing because the national security risks that Congress saw with these joint ventures in China are ongoing, and they've not been addressed using that authority. So I think they can do it, but they've really got to get on the ball. They need to put out the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. They need to shape the debate, get the input they need. They need to get to work. It doesn't need to be a copious list of foundational technologies, but it needs to be focused on where the real national security risks exist.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Kevin, feel free to sort of jump in on any of that.
Sure.
But also, I just wanted a broader question. You were at BIS, you're head of it. How do you see the administration sort of implementing that? David mentioned concerning that they haven't done foundational yet, but generally, what are they, from your perch, what do you think they're thinking? How are they thinking about it? What are they doing? What should they be doing?
Sure. First, thanks for inviting me. This is a terrific discussion. Happy to help, and it's something I've been living for a long time. And thanks for distributing my testimony before Senate Banking last June. That sort of sets out my thinking of standards for how to approach this issue. A couple of quick thoughts as I lead into that. First, everything that David is describing was bipartisan. It's rare that David and I would agree on most policy topics, but on FIRMA and ECRA, there was overwhelmingly bipartisan acceptance, and as my testimony evidenced, I was a big advocate of both the FIRMA legislation and what eventually became ECRA, to create a permanent statutory authority for the dual use and other export controls. So that's a rare good news story in Washington. Then to lead up to the answer to your question, in ECRA, what it largely did is it codified sort of core principles of an effective dual-use export control system, and one of those principles is that multilateral controls that are had by multiple countries as part of the international export control regimes, are far more effective than unilateral controls that only the U.S. imposes, because history has shown for decades, and if you've lived this long enough, you've seen this same story over and over, that unilateral controls or unilateral actions tend to end up hurting the very U.S. industry that you're trying to protect, because the work and the research goes elsewhere where the controls don't exist. So multilateral controls are hard. But unilateral controls, the statute says, are still authorized, but in rare circumstances with a fairly high standard. And this is where the Section 1758 comes in that David referred to, which is the standard for imposing unilateral controls on emerging and foundational technologies, the types of technologies that are not now controlled but are essential to national security for the reasons that David announced that should be controlled. And David is correct that the legal authority to do what's in Section 1758 was in the regulations before. I created it in 2012 in a regulatory section called OY 521, which allows for the quick imposition of unilateral controls over, guess what, emerging technologies. We didn't use foundational, but we did use emerging to catch things that didn't then exist but were new and met a national security standard and should be controlled quickly on the condition that they go to the multilateral regime so that the allies control the same technologies equally. And the standards that are in 1758 that Congress laid out to sort of flesh this out, and I'm a huge supporter of it, said that you can use unilateral controls over emerging and foundational technologies, and we, Congress, are telling you, Commerce, and the interagency process to begin a vigorous effort to identify what those technologies are in a regular order way with public comment and input from experts. But they can only be the types of controls that satisfy three standards. That the technologies are not widely available outside the United States, that imposing a unilateral control in the short term would not harm domestic research into that underlying technology, whatever it is, and that whatever technology control you impose, whatever unilateral control you impose, would have to be effective at preventing it from going to the country of concern, which is China. And that's a fairly high standard, but it's a proper standard because given the nature of unilateral versus multilateral control. So to answer your question about what they're planning or what they're effective, or the question I often get asked is, why haven't they done anything? You have two answers. One is that it's really hard. I mean, the existing dual-use control lists are already fairly expansive in terms of the types of catch-all technologies that they control. And to identify properly without doing inadvertent harm to controls that are widely available, et cetera, finding what meets those three standards is a difficult exercise. And then and I'll finish with this last point. The other difficulty in it, and an element of your question about whether they're moving fast or slow, is what your definition of national security is, because the statutory standard is that control should be imposed on those technologies that are essential to national security. And as I laid out in my testimony, the sort of traditional definition of national security is for dual-use commercial items is that which plays a critical role in a military or providing an adversary with a foreign adversary with a military or intelligence advantage. You look at the military aircraft and you look at the radar or the stealth capability or the hot section components, and you work your way backward to the commercial technologies that are critical to that. And if diversion of those technologies would lead to giving the adversary an advantage, then the dual-use lists are created to control such technologies. But if your definition of national security is much broader, to include economic protectionist elements or addressing a broader economic structure between two countries, then it becomes harder to define what meets that definition. So a long way of saying is, in terms of what they're doing, they published a notice, they asked for industry input, they're going about proposing rules to the various multilateral controls that meet the emerging technology standard, and whether they do or don't publish in 2020 lists of unilateral controls called emerging or foundational, I have no idea. I really don't know what the answer to that question is. It could be that they're deciding that the better course is to continue the research that they're doing and getting that into the multilateral export control system so that any new controls that come out are those that are the same in Germany or France or Japan, so that the U.S. is not left alone in imposing controls over particular technologies. So I've got a 30-minute and a 3-hour and a 3-day version. So I'll just have to, constrain myself just to that and move on to the next question. Sorry.
Maybe you could do the 3-day thing as just a video blog.
Another time, and a video blog. I'll do the 3-day session. Yeah.
I'll tune in. So one of the I sort of asked David this question, but I want to ask you to come. Assuming that the emerging list comes out, and assuming it's broad, I mean, we really have no idea. We filed both on AI and the whole list, and our argument was the same as yours. Don't put things on there that certainly don't act on things if they're available with other countries. But assuming the list is broad, what are the implications of that?
For me?
Yeah.
So
especially in terms of,
Yeah.
can you sort of square the circle by saying, okay, we're going to limit JVs with a broad list, but we're going to enable us to sell things to China where there's not real military use, which is in our interest.
Right. So in what David referred to earlier in reference was something called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in the fall of 2018, where Commerce listed, I forget the exact number, 20 or so different technology categories: artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, quantum computing, et cetera, and said that it was studying which of those types of technologies warranted control as emerging, and they would deal with foundational later, emerging being technologies that don't yet exist or are not yet mature, and foundational being technologies that are mature. And so what a lot of people concluded, given the Trump administration's broad definition of national security in other contexts, like in 232, and the Made in China 2025 objectives of acquiring each of these technology sectors to the economic gain of China to the detriment of the United States, that would result in broad sweeping controls over each of these areas. But remember the statutory standards that I rattled off. They have to be not widely available, not harm domestic research in the area, and would be effective at limiting their transfer from third countries into China or other countries of concern. So the first impact of a very broad sweeping control over, for example, all AI or all robotics or all semiconductors would be that it would be inconsistent with the core element of the statute. Because by definition, if you impose a control over an entire technology sector, you can't meet those standards. And the way the statute is set up is that it's meant to force commerce to find very specific subsets of those technologies that meet those specific definitions, and then get public comment on those, and then regulate those in a traditional, narrowly tailored way. The second, from an economic impact, of course, is that by definition, with a unilateral control over broad technologies, where these are technologies that evolve rapidly, unlike basic commodities that stay the same forever. As John can describe better than I can, semiconductors and other high tech, they evolve every 18 months. And what is a function of their evolution? It's not geography, it's investment in talent. And investment in talent can go almost anywhere in any advanced country. And so what would happen with broad sweeping controls over entire high technology sectors is that the investment in talent would simply go to the countries where they didn't have these controls, and they were able to study and research and trade more freely. So that's the core, that's why the statutory element of ECRA on unilateral controls created such a high bar for standards, so as not to create a structure that effectively created incentives for U.S. researchers, U.S. investment, U.S. scientists, U.S. technology development in whatever area to simply move to other allied countries where the same work could be done for a global market.
John, I want to come to you, but not quite yet. Because I want to set up the Huawei thing first. But before I do that, Kevin, you mentioned that the ECRA laid out very clearly, David made that quite clear in his boss and the bosses.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the administration has to do that, right? So they could just ignore it. And if they did ignore it, like put things on there that are broadly available and would have a negative effect on our R&D and wouldn't really hurt these Chinese companies, what is the relief for that? Is it can one take the government to court at that point, or?
Wow, I don't know. I haven't thought actually about that.
Might be good for the law firms.
It would be good for the law firms. I'd have to think through some arguments about if it went broader than the statutory standard. I mean, it would. I'm a lawyer, and I like doing lawyer work, obviously. But what makes that difficult is that phrase that I mentioned, which is the precursor into the statutory standards for what to control, which is essential to national security. And each administration is entitled to come up with its own definition of national security, and courts are generally quite deferential to an administration's definition of what that means. And, there are legitimate concerns about everything that David described of acquisition over broad categories of foundational technologies that, in a broader sense, have a national security implication. So I'd have to think harder, but I'm not sure what the remedy would be. I think from a legal perspective, the practical perspective is that it would be the traditional Congress getting involved, the committees of jurisdiction, banking, and House Foreign Affairs, who are the oversight committees for this area, saying that type of action is not consistent with what we intended with ECRA, and the two committees taking a leading role. So that's not a very good answer, because I can't give you a clear legal answer. It would be more of a political solution than a legal solution.
Okay, thank you. So let's jump into Huawei.
Did you say you were going to set me up for the Huawei question? Is that what you just said?
That's what I said. Okay. You can do it. You can do what they do in Congress. You can answer whatever question you want. So here's the Huawei. I mean, I think, look, Huawei is an important question. I sort of think we're suffering from HDS, Huawei derangement syndrome. Somebody I won't say who it was just quoted as saying Huawei is an arm of the Communist Party and should be treated as such. It is difficult to imagine that at the height of the Cold War, the DoD would condone American companies contracting with KGB subsidiaries because Moscow offered a discount. If you really believe that, then we should just simply not do anything with China. I mean, in fact, every major company in China has a Communist Party. Either they're a state-owned enterprise or they have a Communist Party apparatchik telling the company what they can and cannot do. So if we really believe that, we shouldn't be selling anything to China. So obviously, I would argue this is Huawei derangement syndrome. But Kevin, you said, can you just, so the administration last year is part of the overall, the entities list, and ZTE was on because of selling to Iran. Mm-hmm. Now Huawei's on that, but it's not clear are they on it because of that? Are they on it because of 5G security? Are they on it because we don't like Huawei as a champion? It's really unclear what message the administration is doing. But they did do this 25% U.S. content. If you were above that, you had a problem in selling to Huawei. And now they recently proposed reducing that to potentially 10% or zero. Any company in the world that was using American IP or even American machines, I believe, could be stopped. And then, importantly, DoD vetoed that a couple of weeks ago or a week and a half ago. And then what I read just a couple of days ago was that the political people at DoD vetoed the staff people at DoD to perhaps give this a green light. That's where I want John to talk about. But Kevin, can you just talk a little bit about what's the thinking behind that? What's the logic? What's the rationale?
Of the de minimis threshold or
the de minimis threshold, yeah, and then bringing it down.
Okay, so the 25% de minimis threshold was actually set in law in 1979 in the Export Administration Act, which stated that U.S. U.S. export control laws didn't apply extraterritorially to foreign-made items that contained less than 25% U.S. origin-controlled content. And that plus the directly related prong, direct product prong of the regulations was put in place in the 70s and reformed a little bit in the 80s and then codified in the 1990s, so that U.S. law only applied to foreign-made items if those items were sensitive as defined by the multilateral regimes, items that had a clear dual-use proliferation or conventional military application. And in order to not interfere with our allies, there was some incidents with Russia and the pipeline and our European allies in the 1980s. Commerce has always very carefully not applied the export control rules extraterritorially to apply to non-sensitive foreign-made items that other countries don't control. And the U.S., by the way, is really one of the only countries that applies this law extraterritorially. The media that you're referring to was discussion in the media, and there have been no proposed rules on this, so you have to sort of piece together, Reuters and Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and a bunch of others that are following this closely. The administration is wanting to change the de minimis and the direct product rules so that a foreign-made item that contains more than 10% any kind of controlled content, whether it's a toaster or a semiconductor, would be subject to U.S. export controls if destined from outside the United States to Huawei or HiSilicon. And the motive there is to impose more leverage over Huawei to have a bigger economic impact on Huawei. And then that ultimately goes to what the core purpose of the entity list is, which I used to administer when I was in the Commerce Department, and I was the father of the ZTE entity listing, so I'm obviously a proponent of the tool, which is to get the foreign company to stop engaging in the bad act. The reason that whatever the bad act is, and the standards in the statute are engaging in acts contrary to national security or foreign policy interests, so it's a very open-ended standard, but traditionally has been applied when there is a bad act in an export control or sanctions or proliferation or terrorist-related activity. But those, with ZTE, when we added ZTE to the list, the reason that was effective was because we caught ZTE by surprise. It didn't have an opportunity to stockpile or adjust its inventory in order to deal with being cut off from U.S. origin content or foreign origin sensitive content. And then the other reason that the ZTE case was different was that we had a very clear, bright off-ramp where we said, and this was in the Federal Register notices, so this is no inside baseball here, that if ZTE stopped engaging in the bad act, i.e. exporting U.S. origin items onto Iran and North Korea and other embargoed countries, and agreed to give us access to their documents and fully cooperated in the criminal investigation, then we would take them off the list. If they didn't, we wouldn't. So it was quite binary. And then the other thing that was different in terms of why it didn't have a collateral effect psychologically on other parties in China afraid that they might get added to a list is that we deliberately published all of ZTE's internal documents on the Commerce Department website showing their plans to set up front companies in order to buy U.S. origin content and divert it onto Iran and North Korea. And they even had a line in their internal documents that if the U.S. government ever finds out about these plans, they will put us on their blacklist. So there was a straightforward, clear law enforcement reason for the listing that didn't result in collateral psychological effects with others. With Huawei, they had lots of opportunity and chance to prepare. The exact reason why they're on the list in the media has flipped from, the sanctions issue to imposing economic harms to cybersecurity, to cyber intrusion, to exfiltration, to 5G-related applications. And there's no clear, obvious off-ramp for Huawei in terms of changing its behavior, in terms of getting off the list, because there's a statutory prohibition, unlike with ZTE, that Huawei can't be delisted, and, among other reasons, until the Secretary of Commerce declares that they're no longer a threat to national security, which is not likely to happen in this or many other administrations. So the two situations are very different. So in order to get to your question, in order to impose more leverage over Huawei to get it to change its behavior and to have a desired effect, they have to expand, the Commerce Department is thinking apparently, the types of foreign-made items over which the U.S. government has control in order to assert more leverage over cutting off the flow of content to Huawei. So that's changing the 25% rule down to 10 and removing the controlled parameter and expanding out the direct product rule so that foreign-made items that are not sensitive, that are not controlled, that are not on the list, that are made with U.S. technology or U.S. equipment are controlled as well. And then the administration assumes, from the media reports, that will create more leverage that will result in Huawei to change its behavior. So that's the background to the 25% rule, the motive for the change, as I understand it, and I'll leave others to discuss the implications of it.
Okay, thank you. All right, with that set up,
Yeah.
John,
How's that for a second?
I'm ready to go.
Are you
Is that
ready to
good?
leave
Okay.
or
I'm ready to not leave. To go.
not leave, ready to go? Good, thank you. John, for you, USTR, you got a long background in this. You've been thinking about it a long time, and obviously this is a big issue for the U.S. semiconductor industry, which is an industry that runs an export trade surplus, is our second biggest R&D investor, good jobs. How's the industry thinking about this? What are your thoughts and concerns?
Well, we do think about it a lot. If folks haven't been constantly checking their Twitter accounts, a rather important morning on this subject, very subject. The president has been tweeting some interesting perspectives on all this. And let me just read a couple of them.
Is he watching our video?
I'd like to think he is, but I think
He's going to watch Kevin Wolf's 3-day presentation.
Yeah.
So there's some ungenerous things about what's being contemplated and circulated in terms of new regulatory reforms that he mentions. Then he says, I want to make it easy to do business with the United States, not difficult. Everyone in my administration is being so instructed with no excuses. And there's a couple more things here. The United States cannot and will not become such a difficult place to deal with in terms of foreign countries buying our product, including for the always used national security excuse, ...
So I'm going to take credit for that.
So
I think
go
our
for it.
event this morning was a signal.
So there, I'll just say there has been some confused waters for us in terms of understanding exactly what the U.S. government intends on doing in terms of Huawei and the China market generally. And we hope that this guidance will help bring some focus to the USG effort. As you mentioned, China is enormously important for us as a market. It's our biggest and fastest growing market. The scale we get from selling to China, roughly 35% of our annual sales, allows us to be the second largest R&D industry in the world. And we totally recognize that it's a difficult and tricky balance between getting national security protected and ensuring that we have economic security. Every government around the world has to deal with that difficult, striking that difficult balance. But what's being contemplated, we understand, with some of the new reforms potentially coming at us, is to put controls on non-sensitive products, commercial products, without a national security nexus. And we think that's not necessary.
What would be an example of that?
Semiconductor chips that go into a cell phone. Things like that. There are now controls on sensitive semiconductor chips that go to China that already exist. So, as part of what do you call it? The HDS, Huawei
Derangement syndrome.
Derangement syndrome. There's a very intense focus on how to deal with Huawei. And what we hope is folks in this town are thinking about the actions that are being taken against Huawei and what they mean for the broader U.S.-China trade relationships. A lot of we can't sell a lot of chips to Huawei, probably for some good national security reasons. But as the U.S. government contemplates expanding the regulatory, the export control reforms in place, would like the U.S. government to think about the chilling effect that this step has on the rest of our Chinese customers and our ability to do business in China. And because that's already been happening. There, not just Huawei as a customer, but other customers in China are chilling to procuring our products because some of them are afraid that they're next, and why not go to another customer?
I mean, I'd heard stories, I don't know whether they're true or not, about applications as simple as Chinese Fitbits, which no national security, and they're, well, if we've got American chips, we might get cut off and might die, and we're going to think about our either foreign non-U.S. strategy or domestic China strategy for that. Is that the kind of thing you're worried about?
Exactly. And one thing to keep in mind is that semiconductors in particular, while we invented semiconductors here, Rob, and we've been global leaders for 50 years, we don't have a monopoly on semiconductors. There's other major players around the world, such as Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Europe, that sell chips all around the world. And what one of the problems with export control, why it's so tricky, is unless it's done multilaterally, we just shift our market share to our overseas competitors. And so it's absolutely essential that when you're contemplating export controls on our technologies, other technologies, that you think about foreign availability of the products.
Yeah, I was in Italy a few months ago, and I visited a pretty interesting machine building company, and they have, obviously any machine today has chips in it, and they had American chips in their machine, and they seriously were considering redesigning the machines to use non-U.S. chips because they just don't want to get caught up in that. Now, I'm not saying that's happening on a broad level, but you certainly hear that. I heard that when I was in Brussels, where European Commission officials were worried that somehow their companies would get caught up in this, and
So great point. What you don't want is to create an American economy where the IP is more valuable outside of America than it is inside of America because of that export control. And what you're talking about is not just chip companies, but technology companies are looking at this, and when they're thinking about their future ambitions for investment, is it going to be investment here in the United States behind an ever-growing export control wall, or is it going to be outside that wall? 80% of our customers are outside of the U.S. And in fact, most technology companies, it's a similar environment. So when you're putting up export controls, you have to think about what it's doing to the investment environment at home. One other thing I'd like to point out is when you're putting up export control walls, what's that doing to the U.S. in terms of making it a less or more desirable place for investment?
Sure.
If you're going to build some new manufacturing facility with some high-tech output, are you going to put it here behind the export control wall or somewhere else outside the wall?
Sure. Yeah, no, if you're a CEO, obviously, and you think the risk is higher of not being able to sell globally if you produce here, then you'll put it somewhere else, absolutely. So I want to ask anybody this question, drilling down a little bit more into Huawei. It doesn't seem like that the administration has ever given, although maybe I've just missed it, sort of what is the clear strategy and rationale for Huawei? I mean, why Huawei? Why not Lenovo? Pick any company that's a Chinese Alibaba. I mean, pick any company. So clearly one is that somehow we don't believe that Huawei networks are secure with 5G, particularly as we move to software-defined networks. And I don't have a position on that. That's obviously a national intelligence and security one. They say they're insecure. Okay. But we've already addressed that in the U.S. with the import ban on Huawei. None of the carriers in the U.S., including the smaller CLECs, are going to be using Huawei equipment going forward. So that's not the issue here. What do you think is going on here? What's the rationale? Anybody can take that.
You want to do this one, David, or shall I start?
Well, neither one of us speaks for the administration, but I guess we can channel our.
Yeah.
Why don't you start and I'll piggyback.
Yeah. So the concerns in my view, given my former position as someone who used to see the intel and started the case against ZTE, and from media reports was looking into lots of other companies. I don't deny the underlying concerns the administration has regarding the national security threat the company presents. That's not my point. And I'm actually quite sympathetic with the desire to do something from this administration and to be aggressive and to prevent the collateral effects that were being described, the cybersecurity issues, the diversion to embargoed countries issues, the topics that were laid out in the indictment from just a couple of days ago. Those are all very real and legitimate, and I personally, as a former policymaker, don't have sort of applaud them for their effort and their focus and their attention with respect to the company and the underlying concerns. That said, you can use tools to accomplish your objectives that are more harmful than helpful, which is what was really being discussed indirectly pertaining to the Entity List, which is very different than economic sanctions, in that it creates these unilateral effects in terms of discouraging companies from wanting to do business with U.S. companies, invest in the United States, and to acquire from U.S. origin content. And if you don't have the advantage, the leverage over the foreign company to get it to change the behavior that you don't like, then you can end up using a tool that's less effective and more harmful than helpful to accomplish the underlying goal. So in terms of what the answer is to your question about what the objective is with respect to Huawei, my sense is that it's all of the above. I mean, in the actual Federal Register notice, it was referred to as, because of its indirect violations pertaining to Iran by one of its officials and disclosures, but from the media, it's everything regarding cyber intrusion, the 5G threat, given the ability to exfiltrate technology and information far more quickly without the ability to stop it. So it's I guess my answer to your question is what the issue is. It's sort of all of the above. Whatever the threats are, those are being addressed. So you have a whole series of actions the government and Congress have taken to address the issue. You have the CFIUS reforms that we just described earlier, dealing not just with Huawei but others on the foreign direct investment. You have Section 889 of the Defense Authorization Act, which came out at the same time as ECRA and FIRMA, that prohibits government procurement involving equipment containing content made by name Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, and a handful of other companies. So that deals with the government procurement side. You have the Internet Communication Technology Supply Chain Executive Order that came out the day before the Huawei listing in May, and the proposed rules came out just before Thanksgiving to basically impose controls on the on commercial transactions involving companies of concern, which, presumably, although Huawei wasn't mentioned, would, if implemented, would create the authority for the Commerce Department to stop the import of telecommunications equipment into the U.S. that could then go into the supply chain and be a threat to critical infrastructure. And then you have this the anti-list action, which is meant to create, or is desired to create, leverage to get it to change its behavior with respect to all of the above. So I don't have that's part of the problem, actually. Whenever you're going to use tools of the U.S. government in order to implement behavior or implement policies and change behavior of foreign governments and to not have collateral effects, they have to be clear, they have to be certain, and part of the problem is the objective is uncertain, even though nonetheless I have sympathy for it. Does that make sense? You can have the two thoughts together.
That makes sense. I want to turn to David. I don't know that rationale makes sense. David, you responded, but my quick response is IP concerns. Look, I can list 50 Chinese companies that have stolen enormous amounts of IP from the U.S., so why Huawei? Cyber intrusions, I can list 200, hundreds of cyber intrusions again, so it's like, I think those are real problems, and we've been, as a think tank, probably more active than anybody pushing back on that, but I don't get the narrow focus on one company. It seems to me it defeats the broader purpose of pushing back against cyber intrusions, pushing back against IP theft. Anyway, David, your thoughts on sort of all this space?
I have to say at the outset a disclaimer, I may have fallen victim to Huawei derangement syndrome, so I'm going to be quarantined for 14 days on an Air Force base, so we'll talk after that. But no, I think Kevin's right. I think all the above really is, the administration, it's been a bit of a moving target for them to describe the exact concern, but I think these are all legitimate. For me, it really goes to cyber and counterintelligence. Maybe as a former intelligence committee staffer, I'm sort of soda straw focused on that, but those are the big problems for me. I also think that Huawei is doing the bidding of the Chinese government. I think it's just a fact, although the quote you read was certainly pretty strong. I do think the kitchen sink approach is a little counterproductive, and I think there are bigger fish to fry overall than just this one company. I think you're right. I think there are macro issues to look at. Can I respond to a couple of the points that John made? I think one of the sort of downsides of the approach the administration has taken is they haven't really focused much on the impact on U.S. industry. And John alluded to that, but I think it's time to really have an adult conversation about the impacts on U.S. industry. It's time to look at some bold actions to help our companies. What I see happening on Huawei, on other large Chinese companies, is them bringing to bear their massive economies of scale and really decreasing our companies' massive economies of scale in a way that I think is, in the long run, going to be very detrimental. Kevin talked about economic sanctions. I think that's a pretty aggressive move, but at least it would have the benefit of having a level playing field for U.S. companies. I think that's a feature that's been missing from a lot of the things that we're talking about here. The foreign availability problem that John alluded to is very real. I think the administration should put a bullseye on that. We should look at ways to make our export control policies more effective and crush that foreign availability, rein those companies in so they've got to play by the same rules that our companies are playing by. We're just not imposing sufficient costs on these, Korean, Japanese, Taiwanese, European companies, and that's undercutting our own companies. We need to really channel this administration's zeal, I think, in a more productive area. But I do agree with John that shutting down access to the Chinese market is short-sighted. I don't think Congress wants that, sort of the consensus view. I think that we should take China's money where it makes sense to do so, and I think that money can be pumped into R&D, and we should do that. The importance of our semiconductor industry to national security would be, I think, impossible to overstate that. And so we've got to really focus on what's happening with our companies as a result of these actions. But Huawei is a real threat, Rob. So I have to push back on that a little bit.
I'm not denying that they're a threat in terms of cybersecurity. I just don't think they're any more of a threat to our economy than many Chinese companies in terms of the overall ability for us to be leaders. We did a report on Chinese biopharmaceutical innovation. I think they're a threat to our industry. Aviation, COMAC is a threat to our industry. Robots, semiconductors, I mean, you name it. Huawei is just one company, and I get that they're sort of the biggest and most dominant Chinese company. You know, again, it's kind of like, why are we focusing on one company when the problem is across the board with Chinese companies and Chinese policies? I'll come back to the other issue, but John, go ahead.
Yeah, in following up to what Dave was talking about, I think that sometimes it feels like an obsession with defensive measures clouds our ability as an economy to focus on a strong affirmative agenda. I think in the tech space, certainly in the semiconductor space, our future will be defined, a success of our future will define more based on how we can pedal faster and not blocking the competition. You need to have the defensive measures in place, particularly when there's national security concerns that come into play, but you also have to have a strong affirmative agenda, and that includes the U.S. government doubling down in its R&D in key areas like AI and semiconductors. You know, we're not asking for handouts as an industry. We plow about 20% of our sales back into R&D. We're also a much bigger focus on talent. We don't have enough STEM kids coming out of our schools, and we have an immigration system that's broken in terms of do a lot to educate talent from around the world to fill the gap because we don't generate enough talent. We do a great job of educating these students coming out of grad programs for electrical engineering and computer science, but we also do a great job of chasing them home and compelling them to work for our competitors against us. One other thing I'd just like to point out. I mean, we've seen this play out where we limit our ability to trade with the Japanese and the Koreans. Last year, the Japanese put limits on the semiconductor making materials, gases and things like that are used for making semiconductors. And for reasons that were not altogether clear, but the long-term impact of this, medium and long-term impact, is that the Koreans are now going to other markets.
You mean they put limits on the exports to Korea?
Exactly.
Because of this little tiff they've had over
there was
World
a tiff
War II.
And so this is the same drama that's playing out with us in China. And I think we should, I think that should be a cautionary tale for us.
So, yeah, I mean, if just to foot stomp that, and I know I've said a lot of things that may be confusing, but just to say something very simple. One, in choosing export control, should be very humble into how much they can do. And because, as John eloquently said, that you can't build an economy on cutting off the flow of technology to a particular country. That's where the solid, clear, coherent definition of national security and foreign policy objectives is vital to knowing what should and shouldn't be subject to export controls. And that's where it's vital to know, as ECRA rightfully points out, when an export control can and cannot be effective. And that goes to the multilateral versus unilateral controls. And it's more than just the China-Japan example. I mean, the Japan-Korea example, but the same thing happened with the U.S. machine tool industry and the satellite industry. And I lived all of these things. And so in my bones, I know that a unilateral control over time will eventually harm the very industry that you're trying to protect. And so if there is a national security objective for a commercial technology because of its application to a military or intelligence application or for broader foreign policy, including human rights objectives, absolutely, I'm a true believer in export controls. But they have to actually be effective. And so just imposing control because it feels good without also trying to do the other things that John just described to help an industry will, in the end, be counterproductive.
So I want to raise one point. And I should just, for people who don't know, by the way, if you haven't seen our work, I mean, for 10 years we've been arguing that China's fundamentally what we call an innovation mercantilist, and we've been arguing loud as we can say that we need to be tough on China, I fully believe we should do that. I just don't think we're doing it the right way. I think it's having harmful effects. I want to just raise this question that came up supposedly in the media. Again, these are all media stories, so it's hard to know exactly what's going on. But the administration appears to be considering cutting off exports of GE jet engines to COMAC. COMAC is the state-owned enterprise that's trying to build essentially an Airbus Boeing clone. They're doing it with massive subsidies. And the idea is, well, we don't think COMAC should exist, which I agree. I don't think COMAC should exist. But the problem with an export control there, as my understanding, is twofold. One is they can buy from Rolls-Royce, so they probably would do that. The second thing, which we haven't talked about, is I guarantee if we did that, virtually every airplane that's bought in China by Chinese airlines is controlled by the government. And what they do historically is they allocate that. They tell the companies, you have to buy this much Airbus or this much Boeing. And if Boeing kind of is not the flavor of the month because they've said something or done something the government doesn't like, they say, okay, now you got to buy a little bit more Airbus, and vice versa. And they use that to play each other off. Guaranteed, if we limit the control of either Honeywell equipment or GE engines, they'll just tell the companies, you can buy Airbus. Because they're not buying COMACs for a long time because they're not good enough. They're still going to be buying U.S. planes for a lot of years. And so we haven't really talked about that, the notion of retaliation, which the Chinese government is perfectly capable of doing. They've shown they've done that consistently. Any thoughts on that? No.
No, it's all right. Go ahead. I've talked a lot, so I'm
Actually, let me
holding
just
back.
throw it's a bit of a tangent from that, and that is this idea somehow that China 2025 is going to push us all into the Pacific very soon, so let's just capitulate and stop sending our stuff to China and just call it a day. It seems like a short-sighted approach. In our sector, semiconductors, China still remains the biggest market for us. In terms of China's domestic semiconductor market, it's still in the single digits. It just seems like the wrong approach, that we should be thinking about dealing with China over a long period and not such a short period. And this idea that we should just capitulate and call it a day just doesn't make any sense when it's such a big market and there's so many resources to be had.
Yeah, and it may become a moot point. I mean, just with every speech I've been giving this year, people always say, keep your Twitter open because it may change during the speech, and literally it happened. I mean, I just want to answer your question. This is President Trump. The United States cannot and will not become such a difficult place to deal with in terms of foreign countries buying our product, including for the always used national security excuse that our companies will be forced to leave in order to remain competitive.
Yeah, no, that's very good.
On the engines, we want to sell products and goods to China and other countries. That's what trade is about. We don't want to make it impossible to do business with us. That will only mean the orders will go to someplace else. As an example, I want China to buy our jet engines, the best in the world. I mean, if I were still in the government and we were debating whether to, block the export of jet engines, and the president tweeted, "I want to sell them."
He tweeted that after I just said that. What's the time on that tweet?
I have seen some of these regulations being circulated, including those being contemplated by Congress, and they are ridiculous. I want to make it easy to do business with the United States, not difficult. Everyone in my administration is being so instructed with no excuses. So, I mean...
No, in all seriousness, that's a very, very positive message.
I think so, but I mean, that's
message.
The problem with the absence of a coherent policy, and with all seriousness, intended. Uncertainty is death to trade, and this constant bouncing back and forth between what the policy or the objective is, or what the goal is, or what national security does or doesn't mean, actually, in my view, does more harm than good with respect to any actual final rule that's implemented. That's obviously a very good sign. A clear, coherent statement of a rational policy directly affecting export controls in China and the very things that we're talking about. But it's now, 2020. What about the last couple of years where, just like we were talking about Huawei, the reasons for the listing are all over the map. The definition of national security is all over the place, and that does more harm to U.S. industry and investing in U.S. industry and companies wanting to buy from U.S. companies or those wanting to invest and do and research and study in the U.S. And so I'm not denying the underlying national security threat, but whatever it is, be certain and clear and direct about it. That's my primary message.
Great.
Chime in,
So,
Rob.
before you do that, David, so David, make your remarks, and then I just want to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, particularly, we could start with anybody from the media, but go ahead, David.
Sure. I was just going to say I agree with the views that were just voiced. I think shutting off the sale of finished products to the Chinese market, I think, is very short-sighted. I think we should drive all the revenue we can from that market. But I think we should do it with our eyes open, because there's a whole graveyard of U.S. industries, frankly, that if you look behind you, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, this is a real thing. I don't think semiconductors or jet engines are something that the Chinese are about to dominate in the next few years. But down the road, we need to have our eyes open that this is certainly the intent. They don't want U.S. companies in China. They want Chinese companies selling into the Chinese market. And we need to have a plan for how to deal with that when that market dries up. I think we should be very, very careful, though, to make sure that as China decouples from us, that we don't let our supply chains be de-Americanized. That's a term that's been, John alluded to as well. That's a very real risk. We've got to make sure that just doesn't happen. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess I would sort of second what John said, though. To me, every dollar we sell of a product that's non-military to China is a dollar revenue that they don't have for them to reinvest in R&D, and it's a dollar we have to support R&D and jobs in the U.S. So, I mean, we see that with the Google case, for example. Everybody's hand-wringing. I have no idea whether Google plans to go back to China. I hope they do. And the reason I hope they do is because, first of all, they're not going to change Chinese state control of information. That's a delusion. China's still going to do that, but it'll take market share away from Baidu, and it'll give us market share. And that's, to me, the whole point of this game is, can we get market share over the Chinese? And anything that sort of gets in the way of that, with a few exceptions, obviously military issues are, to me, it should be a no-brainer, but it doesn't appear to be. Mm-hmm. All right, any questions? If you want to just raise your hand, and even if you're not from the media, feel free to just we'll go right here. If you could just wait for the mic and also say who you are.
Hi, thank you. I'm Gerald Epstein at National Defense University, obviously speaking only for myself. I follow this issue somewhat, but I haven't dived into the details, so I guess this is a bit of an outsider view, but I'm really struck by the two questions. A, what is the problem we're trying to fix? And B, what is the end state we're trying to achieve? And it seems to me that in the case of Huawei, again, based not on the detailed exam, but on what I've heard here, the problem at core is Huawei equipment in allied networks. And so the end state one would suggest we're trying to achieve is to get rid of it. That's either done by somehow Huawei just abandoning that market, or two, killing the company. And that everything that's been asked is trying to kill Huawei as a company. And this reminds me of the long-standing debate on sanctions overall. Are you trying to get a country to do something in particular or to not do something in particular? Or are you arguing for regime change? In many cases, sanctions are proposed because what one really wants to do is to crush the country and force regime change, as opposed to motivating a specific behavior. So it just seems to me that the parallels just seem striking here between this economic argument and the long-standing sanctions versus regime change argument.
Yeah, excellent.
So sure, I mean, that is an argument people make, that we should kill Huawei so they don't use them in the UK or German networks and somehow. But again, if you're going to attack the king, you got to kill the king. And it's not clear to me we can do that, number one. Secondly, it's not clear it's the best way to do it. Anyway, thoughts on that? The broader issue of foreign networks.
It goes to it's an excellent summary of my main point. To know what you want to accomplish, you have to know what problem you're trying to solve before you start taking action to solve it. And what is the objective with the Huawei listing? And if it's to put the company out of business, well, then you would take very different approaches. If it's to change their behavior with respect to diversions to Iran and North Korea and other sanctioned countries and export control issues, that's one side of response. If it's with respect to keeping Huawei equipment out of 5G networks in the U.S. and allied countries, well, then there's a whole other suite of tools. And export controls is only a tiny sliver of all of that. And to this administration's credit, it's doing sort of an all of the above type of approach in addressing an issue. But first, to know which ones to use and which triggers to pull, you have to know what the objective is. And I can't tell what the objective is always.
I'm glad you didn't take on the regime change question, Kevin.
All right.
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I think Yeah, I think that sums it up well.
So, Jerry, to your point, I was in Brussels a couple weeks ago, and this issue came up, and everybody wants to buy Huawei in Europe because it's cheap. The reason it's cheap is because they've gotten $70 billion in state aid, according to the Wall Street Journal, which I believe that number. So I said to the Europeans, I said, why don't you just have a state aid tariff equal to the level of price the price discount you would get? And they're very intrigued with that idea. And I think if you did that, you would start to see much more price competition with Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung.
I can't imagine the Europeans being excited about
Well,
raising taxes.
Now, the next point,
That was sarcastic.
yes, was no, they were actually okay with that because they were okay conceptually with that, but they said no, we can't do that. I said why not? And they said because the Chinese would retaliate against Ericsson and Nokia, who do have sales in China. And that to me gets to the real point here, which is I just simply think that this is utter failure of unilateralism. We're not going to succeed on what we need to do, and we got to shift to multilateralism. And we wrote a big report on that. My colleague Nigel Corey recently, where we looked at how the U.S., the EU, and Japan should work much more closely together on this. And so, anyway, any thoughts on that? Whether you think that's appropriate and possible and useful.
I've been involved in dealing with China policy challenges for maybe 15 years, and every time we prevailed, there's been collaboration among governments, like-minded governments, a layer there, and also a layer of collaboration among like-minded industries. And without that kind of multilateral approach, in all the experiences I've been involved in, they've not been successful.
Yeah, same here. And as I described in the notes that you all published, multilateralism is hard. I mean, it's relatively easy to write a rule, publish it in the Federal Register saying thou shalt not export X or Y. I mean, that can be done with interagency clearance, and all it takes is the time to write it and get it cleared. But if you really want to accomplish change in this multilateral world, a multinational world with technologies that are ubiquitous in these areas, you need the support of the allies. And I know that part of the motive for FIRMA was how slow, and desire to get CFIUS involved in this is how slow the multilateral regime process is. It can take a couple of years before a control becomes effective, and by then, the Chinese acquirer has already eaten their lunch, and the technology has already been transferred, and the harm has already been done. I got that, but my core view is that the alternative is worse, and if the multilateral system isn't working, put more resources into it, provide more evidence to the allies, get more people to the regimes, come up with subgroup regimes of smaller groups of countries that are really actually involved in this. And I know the administration is working that way, and to their credit, they're thinking about smaller groups of countries to address some of the core threats. But you have to take into account that change is even harder in other domestic systems. Since this is about an export control topic, the U.S., my foreign counterparts would always envy the U.S. system because we have extraordinary discretion in how we implement. We have vast statutory authority and a great deal of flexibility in coming up with creative ideas to solve problems. Most of our other allies are much more traditional. We only impose controls over specific commodities and technology that are identified on one of the multilateral control lists, and only if we can identify a specific specific conventional military or WMD or proliferation-related application or diversion of it. And we can't act unilaterally. We can't impose controls over individual companies or individual end uses, whereas in the U.S. it's much more liberal. And so, I guess, my worldview on this, if you want to use export controls to accomplish these, it's more attention toward the multilaterals, more attention to getting our allied friends to have more liberal and flexible capabilities within their own systems, and then we can start acting in more concerted action rather than just the U.S. publishing a notice in the Federal Register alone. So it's hard, but it's far better than the alternative of unilateralism.
I may come back on that, but let's take a couple more questions here, and then we'll go to the back. Yeah.
Brett Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade. David, you mentioned the idea that Made in China 2025 is aimed at China decoupling from the U.S. specific to high-tech products, so they can essentially not rely on U.S. exports. What is how should the U.S. government be responding to that? And is the idea that they should take a careful approach to export controls about making sure that China cannot become self-reliant in that sector?
Well, I'm not sure the goal is making sure China can't become self-reliant, but I think it's ensuring a level playing field. I mean, what should the U.S. government do? I think export controls are a big part of it. I think the 301 investigation, some of the things that were proposed were good. Not a lot of them didn't get off the ground. I don't know. John, do you have any brilliant ideas?
Well, I have the advantage of having my expertise being just one corner of the overall problem, which is export controls. And my primary point is export controls are a vital tool, but they're not the only tool. And to address the underlying issues, you have to go through all of the other strategies and work them out. So, I mean, that's a whole other longer discussion. I don't have, unfortunately, a pithy answer to respond to what to do with the Made in China 2025 issue.
I think a lot of it goes to the opportunities that exist for U.S. companies. And we're talking about multilateralism. I think whether it's export controls or whether it's sort of trade policy writ large, we've got to make sure that as this market in China shrinks in the next few decades or sooner, that there are offsetting opportunities elsewhere, that whether we reinvigorate the TPP or try to open up develop new markets for our companies, there's got to be a way for our companies to continue to have those economies of scale and to have revenue to stay afloat and to really be dominant in industries like semiconductors.
Yeah, two quick follow-on thoughts I just thought of. So, David did a great job. There's a provision in FIRMA that requires the administration to go and work with their allies to get them to adopt similar foreign direct investment regimes. So that's sort of a movement in the multilateral direction on the investment side. TPP from the previous administration had as a core virtue trying to accomplish some of the same objectives by getting our Pacific allies aligned in a common economic arrangement in order to be able to have leverage to change behavior on much broader issues than just the export control national security issues. That's another example of multilateral action to accomplish a goal rather than imposing individual controls. So every option, every tool, it always comes back to, given the nature of the technology, the U.S. can't do it alone.
Just to your point real quickly, I think the Chinese grand strategy is the opposite of export controls. They want to export everything, and they have import controls. They don't want to import things. They have no desire to import semiconductors, ever. Now, they're a long, long way away from that, which we have to understand, but there's lots of advanced technology they don't want to import. In the back here, Roger.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I work with private equity in the technology sector, and the ineffectiveness, for the most part, of unilateral export controls, I think, pretty much stands to reason. The panelists illustrated that. The question I have is really the contrary circumstances. What are the circumstances under which unilateral export controls are advisable? And then that question, I really want to put it in two parts. First of all, purely military technology. And, there's a great deal of military technology that is widely available, a great deal that's outdated. But under what circumstances are unilateral military export controls advisable? And is it always, or is it only if it's not readily available elsewhere? And the second question has to do with the non-military or dual-use technologies. Are there any non-military or dual-use technologies, prominent technologies, where anyone on the panel thinks that unilateral export controls have any reasonable chance of being effective? Categories, technological categories. So the military and the non-military are slightly different. Thank you.
No, excellent question. So ECRA is very clear that unilateral controls are not prohibited. And as one who wrote the unilateral control rule, OY521, I believe that they do have a purpose. And here are some examples of where it would be perfect. So sometimes there are human rights and foreign policy objectives that you want to project your values regardless of whether other countries agree with you. So there are several examples in our controls: crime control items, instruments of torture, where regardless of the widespread availability of the item, it's nonetheless something that the U.S. does not want to, as a principled matter, allow for the export of. So that's one example. Clearly, items where there's a direct threat or clear threat to the warfighter or a military or intelligence advantage that the U.S. has that another country doesn't. And in that situation, then economic harm is inevitable to the U.S. exporter of whatever that is, but there is a higher virtue given the direct military or conventional military significance. Excuse me? Even if it's not effective, there's a virtue, there's an objective, there's a position of the U.S. government of projecting its value is that we don't want to be a participant in that. On the dual use side, it goes to the effectiveness of it all, and then that goes to the foreign availability question. A unilateral control over a subset of technology that isn't widely available where the U.S. has an advantage on the commercial side, that would be another example. And then in the rule that I put together in 2012 and as baked into Section 1758 of ECRA, the core requirement of any unilateral control where there is a purpose is that it doesn't stay there forever. And those sections both have, within a 3-year period, a requirement that the U.S. take that control, that unilateral control, to the regimes and trying to convince the regimes to adopt the same controls, and then make a hard case after 3 years about whether to maintain that unilateral control or not. So there are circumstances, but they're rare, but when they happen, they're I think, important. And a lot of it is projecting values.
There was a question right here. Comment?
So Bob Donor from the Atlantic Council. None of you have talked about modifying Chinese government behavior. Is that something that we've given up on? Is it possible to do in a way that matters? Things in phase 2 that are under discussion, rules on subsidies, rules on joint ventures, rules on technology transfer. It seems to me that the approach that we have taken has largely been focused on hardening sanctions, which are themselves an incentive to the Chinese to double down on the policies we object to.
I think it goes back to the multilateral theme that we were hitting on. I think the Chinese do respond, to a certain threshold of pain when costs are imposed. But it's really a numbers game. We're not big enough. And in the future years, it's going to be an even bigger problem to really do that by ourselves. We need the Europeans. We need other Asian nations to help bring that pressure to bear to shape the behavior of the Chinese. It is possible, but it's going to take some renewed open-mindedness by this administration to get there, I would say.
Totally agree with Dave on the multilateral piece, but the other thing is there are certain red lines the Chinese will not go over. There are certain aspects to their industrial policy that are too important to them for domestic political and economic reasons. They simply won't change. But I do believe that working with our allies, we can take rough edges off of the Chinese economy, and we should absolutely be focusing on that. Some of that was picked up in phase 1. I would love to have all the state subsidies dealt with in phase 2, but I think realistically, given how important state subsidies are to China's economic model, being overly ambitious on that would probably not be reasonable, but we would like to see that tackled and taken on, because I think there are some, as I say, some of the rough edges of Chinese industrial policy can be smoothed off.
Some of the critics have said that, we don't have a right to, even the Chinese love to say that, we don't have a right to tell them how to run their economy or structure their economy. And at one level, that's right. At another level, we certainly do, because they joined the WTO. So there are rules on subsidies, rules on IP. And I get we're not going to turn them into a libertarian haven of Hong Kong. But to John's point, we could do a lot more there. One of the things that struck me is I'm surprised the administration hasn't done more there. You look at, again, going back to the GE and the COMAC case. We just won a case against Airbus, and rightly so. And we rightly imposed tariffs on the Europeans to comply with the Airbus ruling, because the WTO said we could. COMAC has received significantly more subsidies than Airbus has, and where's the case? Where's the subsidy transparency? And again, to the Europeans' credit, DG Trade is working hard on a more subsidies disclosure. John, you were at USTR. Thoughts on that? Could we get a more serious disclosures of subsidies and then actions through multilateral?
So reporting your subsidies to WTO is a requirement. So that's the first thing we'd like to get out of the Chinese. But also, the Japanese, the Europeans, and the U.S. have already been working trilaterally to try to get subsidies reform subsidies rules reform in the WTO. And multilateralism is very hard work. Getting significant change in the WTO is very hard work. But I don't see how we can realistically tackle our subsidies problems in China without an approach like that.
And to go back to the theme of this topic, export controls has nothing to do with anything that we just discussed for the last 5 minutes, and to keep them completely separate and to try to use export controls as a tool to accomplish those other very complex, worthy goals will always be a mistake and do more harm than good. And this is going back to my core point of being humble with respect to what export controls can and can't do, and they really can't be a tool to solve all those other very legitimate real issues. So that's why when I was in the government, whenever ITA would come to, got some friends from ITA, they would come down the hall, they'd want to solve this problem or that problem, or they'd have a trade remedy issue or something, I would say, keep us out of it, not our part. We're not part of your trade talks. We're not leveraged to be traded off. Our rules exist for national security reasons, and they're not to be part of some deal. It simply won't work, and that's my main point today. Keep export controls out of the larger economic security issues.
Other questions? Well, I have a couple. We'll stop in about 10 minutes. One is, Kevin, you alluded to doing more with our allies. What would that actually look like? We have Wassenaar, we have various means. Could there be a serious, multilateral effort to really beef this up and to give these countries a little bit more flexibility so that they're not so constrained and taking a long, long time, if ever, to sort of get to where we are? How would that process work?
Right.
Also, can I ask Kevin, is there a way of taking a little bit of Wassenaar out of Wassenaar so it moves quicker?
Yes.
And more responsive?
Yes, I agree on all of those. So on the first part of your answer is don't irritate the allies. I mean, one of the ironies of this proposed change on de minimis and direct product, it's going to be asserting U.S. jurisdiction into foreign countries and allies' products that are wholly foreign made, that are not sensitive, that are not controlled by their law. And the whole reason the de minimis and the direct product rules were set as they are now back in the early 1980s was out of comity and respect for our allies and letting their systems control what should be controlled through the multilateral process, as opposed to U.S. inserting its jurisdiction into their business. And I don't know exactly what the reaction of the allies would be to these changes if they were to go forward, but by definition they insert our laws in it. So on the Wassenaar, so there are four primary multilateral regimes: the Australia group dealing with chemicals and toxins, the missile technology control regime, the nuclear suppliers group for obvious areas, and then the Wassenaar arrangement, which is now 43 countries to control conventional military items, dual use and military items in the main. And it is an unwieldy organization. Whenever you have a 43-member organization for which consensus is required in order to be able to make a change, and by change I mean it's a list each year after a year's worth of meetings of dual use and military items that each country that's a member as a political commitment, not as a treaty commitment, should implement in their own domestic law. When you have 43 countries with different levels of expertise and different types of industries and different concerns and maybe not exactly the same objective with respect to what the national security threat is, and clearly very different impressions as to the threat that China presents, it makes it very, very hard to get to consensus and having multilateral controls. And so the motives that David and others had for FIRMA and moving this process in ECRA are all completely valid. And unfortunately, it's a function of more resources and time and top-level commitment to the exercise. And to go to John's point, I really do think that subgroups or small batch multilateralism of the countries that actually have a stake in the particular sector, like they're only, not all 43 of those Wassenaar countries have a semiconductor industry. And so if you want a concerted semiconductor policy with respect to China or any other activity, since these are all political commitments, why can't those same groups of countries come together and adopt a political commitment, change domestic law or policy in order to accomplish it, provide the same evidence and debate it among themselves in order to come to a consensus. So you would perhaps need only 6 or 8 of the countries of Wassenaar to come to a common semiconductor strategy rather than all 43. And I know that the administration has been talking about that. There's been meetings in Brussels that I understand from the media have taken place. But if I were there, or my recommendation to the administration would be put a lot more time and resources and time into that effort, and don't do things in the meantime that piss off the very people that you're trying to get cooperation from. Does that make sense, John? I mean, is that what you were thinking?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
We hadn't coordinated on this, but
Well, we could have.
we could have. Yeah.
So one other thing, I'm able to stop after this. I can see, I know what you're saying, Kevin, keeping it narrow, and I couldn't agree more. We shoot ourselves in the foot. But there's one narrow case that's beyond what you're talking about, which seems like it could have some potential upside, and that's using export controls in the case of a Chinese company that's a systematic IP violator and massive receiver of subsidies. And there I'm thinking of Fujian Hinghua, which is this DRAM company, memory chip company, that was basically created by the Chinese Semiconductor Fund, given, I don't know how much, $3 billion, maybe a large chunk of cash to build, I believe, the largest DRAM factory in the world using stolen Micron technology. So Micron is one of the 3 leading DRAM companies in the world. They're headquartered in Idaho. So the administration blocked exports of some of the key equipment that they used. I was told by my colleague Dan Wang at Geveld Dragonomics, which is a firm in China that studies these issues, and Dan in particular studies the semiconductor industry. He said that looks like it was probably effective, but that the Chinese have 2 more companies in line to just do the exact same thing. Xinhua subsidized company as well, getting into DRAMs, and they will not make the mistake of at least getting caught, shall we say, of stealing IP, but hopefully not make the mistake of stealing IP. So maybe we won the battle, but haven't won the war there. So just thoughts on that? I mean, I know, John, you're deep into this particular.
Yeah, go ahead. I've talked a lot, so
the deterrent impact on others was probably significant, and that's what we hope with this action against Jinhua.
It deterred the other Chinese companies from being so blatant.
Fear of being the next ones.
Yeah.
So you can't underestimate that. Now, whether they're just being more careful about their illicit behavior, we don't know now. But
yeah, it reminds me when I was co-chair of the Obama U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group, and one of the big issues when we were doing that was this issue of the Indigenous Product Innovation Catalog. So it was this catalog the government had with technologies, and you couldn't sell these technologies to China unless you had essentially transferred your technology to a Chinese partner. And so, John, to your point, there was a huge push. The European, the German chamber, our chamber, the Japanese, and they did stop, but I read some circular that I think NDRC put out, and it said, starting tomorrow, you're no longer allowed to write about this or talk about it. And it's not clear whether they just sort of went underground, and clearly that's what's happening with Made in China 2025, where you just think they don't talk about it anymore, but they're still doing things.
So, Rob, entity list purists aside, the fact that was targeted, narrowly focused action against a perceived bad actor, that's the kind of...
With a clear justification.
Clear justification. That's the kind
That's the difference.
action that we feel is most appropriate, the scalpel rather than the sledgehammer.
Sure.
Yep.
I think it was a good move, the entity list action. I was pleasantly surprised by that. It's shocking that that's the only time they've ever done it in the case of intellectual property theft. And if you read the actual notice, I think they said it was because of impacts on the industrial base. It wasn't per the IP theft itself. But if you think about IP theft, it really is an involuntary export, so it's fully appropriate to use that. The bigger shortcoming, in my view, is that the Treasury Department has been sitting on this authority from 2015 from an executive order that Obama put out that allows them to use OFAC sanctions in the case of cyber... Sure, economic sanctions... the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, Foreign Assets Control, they've got this authority that allows them to use sanctions to punish foreign actors who commit cyber-enabled intellectual property theft. I think it was initially used, the same executive order, to punish the election, the folks who interfered in the election. It's got sort of dual prongs, but not once has it been used by that administration or this one to address the rampant problem of intellectual property theft by Chinese companies and individuals, and I think that's just a travesty.
Yeah, and again, it would be so much easier or more effective if we could get the Europeans on board with that as well, and METI and the Japanese and maybe the Koreans, where we all sort of see these egregious cases and say, okay, we're going to punish the company, and then, as John, you pointed out, send a message that if Chinese companies want to try to compete globally, they've got to do it on, legal way. They license IP or they develop their own. Okay. Well, unless there are no more questions, I want to. First of all, I'm really looking forward to the 3-day thing.
I'm serious. Don't tempt me. So.
Let us know when that's posted. We'll send it out. But this was a fantastic panel. Really learned a lot. I hope you all did. And please join me in thanking 3 great panelists.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Rob.
David, thank you.
That was a pleasure.
Thanks, Kevin. We're all good.